talking to customers and prospects about pretty much anything that can live on power: monitoring, automation, reporting, and security. And I seem to be spending an awful lot of time with you currently, Tom, on webinars. So happy to be here this morning.
It has been a virtual run, as you might say, with all the craziness going on around the world. So Randy Watson, I know you're not a very scary guy. People love talking to you, but you got some scary stories around performance today you want to share. So
yeah, looking forward to it. And thanks everybody for joining. You know, if those who don't know me, Randy Watson, I was one of the founders of Mid-Range Performance Group, which got acquired by HelpSystems more than 2 years ago. So glad to be part of that family, and it turned out to work out well. So, and for those that read my bio, I just want everybody to know that I wrote my first program when I was 5 years old, which if you have 50 years of experience, you know, you can take that for what it's worth.
Exactly, Randy. Well, I'm sure your people will be really happy to hear your experience today, and at least you'll give them some warnings down the road. And even though I show up first, I'll turn it over to my scary friend Robin Tatum.
Yeah,
you know, I never want to stand alongside of him because he towers over me. So, which is not saying a whole lot, but he's
well.
Quite
Everybody in security has to be like that, right? That's how I was told when I came on board. But good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. My name is Robin Tatum. I'm the Director of Security Technologies here at HelpSystems. With Tom, I'm one of the IBM champions that lives at HelpSystems, and my role really is to evangelize the security message. So I do a lot of security scans, assessments for customers, do product overviews, training, things like that, and counsel people just in general about IBM security.
Well, thank you, Robin. And then finally, I'm Tom Huntington, EVP of Technical Solutions at HelpSystems. Hard to believe we've been doing webinars for over 20 years now. Yep. So when the pandemic hit, it was a little scary. Our lives changed because Robin and Randy and Ash and myself, we used to travel a lot and listen to customer stories face to face. But here we are today, presenting again yet another virtual event, and yes, also a Power Champion. And by the way, Power Champion program is open for nominations yet. So if you know somebody out there, take a look at that. You can still nominate people. Speaking of agendas, we're going to share some IBM horror stories today. We're also going to share some good stories along the way on how people fixed up some of these scary messes out there. And then I guess we have opening for some Q&A or chats if you have any questions. Anything's fair game today. We got monitoring expert, performance experts, security experts, work management experts. The four of us have seen and done a lot of things around the Power Platform. So really, quite honestly, any question is okay. And with that said, guys, I think I'm going to turn off my video and we'll stop doing that for you, and so that we're not bothering you about that. So let's turn it over to our first scary host today, Mr. Ash Giddens, to talk about one of his experiences on the IBM platform. Go ahead, Ash.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom. Yeah, so I guess I should set the scene like any good horror movie, and this did start out like a cheap horror movie, really. So we came across a managed service provider a number of years ago, and they'd grown rapidly. And to start with, they had no monitoring at all in place. And for a while, that was fine. They had people running around left, right, and center, firefighting, I guess, reacting. And then they reached this, what we used to call the tipping point. They end up with far too many partitions and customers for them to be able to do that effectively. And so they reached this tipping point. They ended up with over 100 partitions, and they couldn't just keep throwing sysadmins at it. It wasn't financially viable. So we worked with them, and we implemented a solution that many of you are aware of called Halcyon. And they loved it. It was great. They could set up rules for everything, not just on I, but on AX, Linux, BIOS, Windows 2. They could set up rules left, right, and center. So anything that moved that they needed notifying about, they could create a rule for it. And not only create a rule, they could get a notification. This could be via email, SMS. It could be via the centralized console that we tend to put in for pretty much every customer. And the centralized console also has these clients as well. So anyway, most of the alerts were going to the console, and they had some escalation built into that. So if they didn't see the alert on the console, it would come via email. It would tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, you know, you've got something going on here. And for a while, they were great with this. They were so happy as Larry, as we say in the UK. We visited them again 6 months ago, and we were shocked. We were horrified, I should say. They were getting too many alerts. They'd set up rules for absolutely everything, and they ended up spending more time managing the alerts than actually looking after the original problem. They didn't know which server or which customer was responsible for the bulk of alerts, so they didn't really know where to focus. They were back to where they started before we spoke to them. They were firefighting. So what was the solution there? Well, there was a number of things, and these are built into Halcyon by default. And the first thing, and it tends to be where people end up, sometimes they have to go on a journey, is monitoring by exception. Now, there's little or very little real value in getting notifications telling you that something has run as expected and on time, when all you really care about is there anything to worry about? There's no point flooding your email box with positive results. So we worked with them in turning their dozens and dozens of rules across hundreds of partitions into monitoring by exception rules. So whereas they used to have a tick list that said, is subsystem up? Are these jobs running in the subsystem? Has that completed on time? They had this manual tick sheet and run book. And what they've done, they basically converted that into rules. So we work with them on being a little bit clever. And we just set up monitoring by exception. Have things finished on time? If they haven't, we'll tell you about it then. The second thing we did was, it's down here, is interconnect multiple rules. So work with them on building some intelligence into their monitoring rules. So for example, if you have a high availability solution, you probably don't care if there's a backlog maybe after your overnight processing or during your overnight processing, when there's lots of activity, lots of transactions. But outside of those times, you know, it's going to be a problem for you. If you need to do a role swap, you're going to be out of date. So connecting maybe a backlog monitoring rule with a rule that looks for your overnight processes completing, not only reduces the number of alerts you need to deal with, but it also adds some logic or some common sense to it, and therefore improves the quality. It applies what we call a human aspect, and that was really worth its weight in gold. And then the final bullet here, as I said, they couldn't see the wood for the trees. They were firefighting, dealing with all these alerts. So we worked with them in connecting their central enterprise console to the Halcyon Advanced Reporting Suite. And by doing that, we were able to pinpoint, or help them pinpoint, where these alerts were coming from, which platform, which was the busiest time, which was the partitions generating the most alerts, and the customers that were generating them. And this gave them a basis of a continuous improvement program. They could produce reports, take to their clients and say, this is what we do for you. It proves value. And by eliminating a number of these alerts, they could actually steal some time back. So I guess this started off as a horrible, cheap horror movie, and ended up with a really slick operation. But it was definitely a journey, Tom, that these guys went on, and they've been long-time Halcyon customers now.
And I can appreciate that. I mean, it's, you know, I've been there before where I've watched an operator at night and they're doing everything manually, and the management team's like, well, what can we do differently? And it's like, well, it's called automation, right? And automation for monitoring. And Otherwise, it is a nightmare where waiting to happen, where somebody submits something out of order, runs something wrong, answers something wrong. We've all seen it. Thank you, Ash, for sharing that one. So if we move on, my story next is in the area of high availability. This is kind of an interesting one because, as you know, we're all in this work from home, COVID type thing. Well, one of the impacts on that is internet providers are extremely busy, and they're providing, and for them, it's additional business growth. And especially for this particular internet provider, who's more of a rural provider of internet services, they were very interested in HA and getting into help with HA. Well, one of their stories they shared with me was that their developers are also on the same partition as their production, which to me right away kind of raises a red flag. But their problem was this, and their horror story is this, that the developer, of course, didn't realize when they were updating some test data that they were over top of the production libraries. And of course, they had bad data updates. And in order for them to bring back this, or to get out of the bad data update process, they had to go back and restore from their previous night's backup, which meant they lost a whole day's worth of business. And then, of course, the whole pain of recreating that information, right? I think Robin probably loves this story because it's like a bunch of no-nos, right? When it comes to security, you really need to separate your development from production. And, you know, on IBM, you certainly can do development and production all in the same partition, but to a certain extent, why would you? Because with virtualization, it's so easy to spin up another partition within the same server to keep your developers off of production, and of course, good security measures. But, you know, the story, as the story goes, they're also in the hurricane belt, right? And so they need HA because their business has grown. They really rely on IBM like we all do. It's a core to our business, and they need business resiliency too, and they don't have that in place today yet. So we're still talking to them. And then one of the other things, as I mentioned to them, once you have local journaling and remote journaling built in, you now potentially have the ability to roll back bad updates or roll back changes, because one of the things that they were looking for was, is there a solution that could maybe delay the apply process over on the target system so that they could always back out of it? And my point to a customer like that is, or to a company like that is, how long is long enough? When are you going to notice that there was a bad update? Is it, 5 minutes of delays? Is it 10 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours? So I said, instead of doing that, what you really want to do to solve this problem is, one, improve your security, improve your change control process. Things can happen, even though you put everything through testing and changes and stuff like that. There is still bad code out there, and there are still bad updates that occur in production. But with journaling, you can remove journal changes and roll back things, or you could apply journal changes. So you could have, they had two options there. They could have removed the changes from the bad updates. There's a feature called before and after images with local and remote journaling that then allows you to remove them. So their options could have been restore their libraries from backup and get that production file back to where they want from the day before, and then apply journal changes up until the bad update, or they could do the remove journal changes. So my story is around the horror of controlling our development staff and making sure that they're on the right system, you have the right security in place. But then, HA could actually be used to help pull you out of that situation, because you can roll back journal changes or apply them depending upon what the situation is to move things forward. That's from my end. How about over to you, Mr. Watson, Randy Watson, to talk about IBM I performance planning horror stories number 1. I guess you got a couple of these.
I got a couple of these. Yeah, thanks, Tom, and great story there. So as my intro was, I get involved with obviously a lot of performance and capacity planning analysis. And when we were designing this presentation, I had many to choose from because we get involved with, the term critical situations or crit-sit that happens, pretty frequently. But the scene was that there was this manufacturer and distributor, happened to be of auto parts. And the scene was they were going to migrate from a Power 8 with all internal SSDs to a Power 9 with external all NVMe. You know, I'm going to say the latest and greatest technology, right? So, you know, we were designing the system and we were designing the CPU and the memory, and we were looking at the disk. And, you know, of course, we were telling them, well, you know, because you're going through, by the way, they went from internal to an external disk, and they were going to go through BIOS this time where they obviously weren't before. But the long story short was that the average response time had increased from 0.3 milliseconds, which is, you know, about, it's really good, obviously, and it's pretty good for internal disk, to 0.4 on the external disk. And you think, well, that's not a big deal. Well, their weekly batch cycle ran several hours longer after migrating, which caused, you know, the delay in some other batch jobs that were running and so forth. So that was the problem. So looking at the situation, you know, what was the solution? Well, first of all, if we set the proper expectations with capacity planning using Performance Navigator, right? Because we actually predicted that would be about 0.4 milliseconds, but nobody really, you know, anticipated the impact of just increasing from 0.3 to 0.4. So that was first thing, looking at this stuff and understand where you're going. In other words, I like to say, look before you leap. Just because it's SSDs or solid state internally and the solid state externally, it's got to be the same. Well, they technically are not, right? And so what could we do? So the solution here was we really couldn't improve the 0.4 milliseconds. The disk was performing, like I like to say, as designed. It was performing as fast as it could go, right? So what we did is using Performance Navigator, we did a job weight analysis profile. And we found out that a lot of the system was waiting on journals. And so what, you know, looking at this thing, we're saying, well, a lot of the waits are happening as far as the runtime of this job was waiting on journals. So the ultimate solution was, even though the disk stayed the same at 0.4 milliseconds, we implemented the option 42 as HA journal caching. They technically already had it installed, but we actually configured the major journals to start using caching. And that actually now, that batch job now runs several hours faster than it did before, even though the disk was slower. So again, sometimes the solution is both not necessarily a hardware solution, but it's a mixture of, you know, hardware and software. So the good news is they're now happy and jobs running faster, and now they can take advantage of all the things they wanted the external disk for, like encryption, like flash copy, like, you know, a lot of reasons why people go to external disk, some of which is not performance, right? There's a lot of other features and benefits, but so at the end of the day, it was all happy, and they're on the next phase of implementing those extra features.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great story, because people add new technology to the system and they think, oh, everything's going to be better because I got this new technology. It might be not configured correctly, or in this case here, they had to go tweak something else that they already had on the system that they weren't using properly in journal caching, because just because you have it doesn't mean, to your point, journals are actually using it. There is an attribute associated with that, right? So, so Randy, I know you have another horror story. Let's go a little more with performance.
Yeah, I could. Like I said, I have many of these, but this was a trucking logistical customer, and they were going to migrate from their on-prem Power 8, and they were going to go to a Power 8 in the cloud, not a Power 9. So the problem was they migrated to the on-prem to the cloud. They, you know, said, and of course, because it was like for like from a CPU standpoint, right? Power 8 to a Power 8, they thought, it's going to run the same, right? Well, all three resources, CPU, memory, and disk, were constrained. I mean, when they migrated, all three of these hardware had the issue, right?
Ooh, that didn't sound like a good decision, Randy.
No, it did not. So, of course, we came in after the fact, right? So the solution would have been, like I said on the first slide, if we had looked at this before, we could have sort of anticipated this issue, right? And again, as I was saying, look before you leap, right? So we then use Performance Navigator to analyze the hardware configuration and make recommendations, right? So now what do we do? You're in the cloud. So now what do you do? It's again, I've already made the move. Do I want to move back? Or do I want to go back to on-prem, or can my cloud vendor address this by, what do I need to do to fix this issue, right? So in this case, using Performance Navigator, we showed them that they need to both increase their desired and virtual cores. So obviously need to increase the CPU to fix that constraint. They had to increase memory. And of course, because this isn't a cloud vendor, you remember it's a multi-tenant environment, right? So, this may sound easy, but sometimes, it may not be as easy as one might think, but they were able to do it because they did have some extra memory. And then on the disk side, the only solution is they had to add SSDs. So the external disk in this case was all spinning disk. And so the only solution is they had to add SSDs to the cloud solution, which then addressed their disk issues, right? And then the last thing is, because this was a scale out system, this was an 814, and we wanted to make sure that you turn energy scale off on the cloud frame. For those who may not know, energy scale is the feature within IBM that manages the megahertz and energy. Basically, it's a way to make sure you're using the energy, cooling, and electricity efficiently, right? Well, it does that by slowing the machine down. So it basically scales back the megahertz of the machine. And so if you have performance problems and you don't care about the electricity bill or the cooling bill, if you're okay in that area, you can actually turn this off. And then your performance would get speed up faster. So here again, it's another way to, I have a problem, but it's identifying the issue and then figuring out what the solutions are, right? In this case, it's, adding memory and CPU and disk and then turning the energy scale off. So it was not moving back. So we were able to keep them on the cloud, keep them satisfied, and continue on with, their strategy.
Well, it's a case where green is not necessarily good, right?
Correct.
If your end users are screaming at you for performance, you got to do all you can do, right? Wow. Interesting. Just going to the cloud, it's all virtual, right?
It's all virtual.
Yeah. Things can happen. All right. Well, thank you, Randy, for sharing those two stories. I think we have a third story from you, and this time with the auto industry. So you're picking on all industries.
Yeah, people often ask me, do you specialize in, any particular vertical? And of course, the answer is no, we don't really care. We're application agnostic, as I like to say. But this was the case where this auto industry customer, they upgraded their ERP application, and they were already in the cloud, right? And the problem is when they did that, that's when the performance problems arise, right? And of course, everybody was scrambling, trying to figure out what the cause was. And as the solution said, look at a Performance Navigator. In this case, this is sort of like a problem determination, more of a capacity planning exercise here, right? So, but we're all using the same data. But using Performance Navigator, it was pretty easy for us to identify the root cause was I/O, and it wasn't. And the problem is obviously performance problem it was the increase in disk response time, right? And the issue is this new application started doing drastically increased the number of IOs it was doing. And for that matter, I believe the size of the IOs also were impacted. So just upgrading the application caused this. They were running fine in the cloud before. But now the question is, what do you do, right? So we use Performance Navigator in this case. Okay, I've identified the problem. What's the solution? Well, again, this was it's a cloud vendor, and this is one of the potential advantages because they have flexibility, right? Depending on your vendor, they had to add SSDs to the configuration. right? So it's a disk problem. We got to address it. And in this case, the only way to do that is to add SSDs in the pool that they were being virtualized to. So they did that, and they addressed the problem.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing those, I guess, scary free stories, right? I don't know if I should say thank you on that, because those were obviously nightmares for each one of those customers as they went to this new technology, all excited, or this new application, and oh my God, the brakes hit, right? So,
yep.
Well, over in the world of security, it's never scary, but I think Robin Taven might have some stories for us. Robin?
Yeah, there's rarely horror stories on the security side, right? We have to dig no, we don't have to dig that deep for this. We unfortunately see this all too frequently. And in this case, I have to redact the scene a little bit, because when it comes to security, customers are a little sensitive, of course, to the idea that they may not have the controls configured quite correctly. But what I can reveal is that this was a trucking company. It was a transportation company, and they were working with us. They'd actually done a risk assessment with us. We determined that there were some exposures on their system, and they were actually leaning on us for one of the solutions. So within our portfolio, we have a tool called Exit Point Manager, and I talked about this in my session earlier, but it's basically a suite of exit programs that are designed to oversee and control access from the network to the IBMI. Now, in this case, the customer had recognized that there was some potential risk, and they'd asked us to set up a proof of concept within their environment using our software so that they could kick the tires in their environment and make a decision. And while I was showing them, in essence, some of the basics of how to set up the rules and run reports, we actually issued a report request that went out and came back with 16 pages worth of very interesting information. And that's in the fact that the report came back indicating that there were a number of failed connection attempts coming into their system, literally while we were running this proof of concept, from profiles like admin, root, user 123, and it was coming back and reporting this. And at the time, the customer, pulls up this report expecting to see some of his ODBC traffic and some of the test instructions we were sending through. And it kind of sent him into a bit of a tailspin, because in this case, they did determine that the IP addresses were external. So, cut a long story short, the exit programs were reporting that there were failed connection attempts. And Tom, if you do want to go on to the next slide there, I did extract a copy of a couple of those 16 pages. And you can see here where the action taken was rejected, but where I've redacted the IP address in the middle. It was an IP address that was external to their network. That was what obviously triggered the alarm bells in their admin when I showed the report to them. And they immediately went and did some investigation, determined that IP address was from Southeast Asia, and that it had somehow gotten through their firewall. It hadn't circumvented it, but they had a configuration error in their firewall. And once the actor had gotten onto their network, had found that FTP in this case was responding to them. So then they knew it was an IP address out there, and they would just ping it. About every 6 seconds or so, they would hit this box with a connection attempt from these various cycled user profiles that we immediately recognized were not typical in the IBMI world, that tend to live more in the Windows and Linux worlds. And so it was a very generic attack, but the fact that we were able to reveal this to the customer as we were trying to demonstrate the function of an exit program was worth its weight in gold. I mean, I'll tell you, it was the fastest software sale, I think, in HelpSystems history, and it's understandable. But at the end of the day, it just goes to remind that having visibility into the types of connections that are happening to your IBMI, even if you think in your mind that the IBMI is not connected directly to the internet, as it was in this case where there was a firewall around the system, it's not impenetrable. And if somebody gets through that, we need to make sure we have defense in depth, layered based security to control that access. So very eye-opening. It was a first for me personally, and the customer was shocked, but very happy we were the ones to find it.
And Robin, the scary thing about this is they're not the only one. I was doing one, as you know, I do a lot of tech updates with our customers, and I started a rather interesting conversation when I was talking about exit point managers, and I told this story. And one of the IBMI people told the security team that, yes, they had seen the same thing on IBMI that had gotten through their firewall.
Yeah, it's crazy, and that stuff does happen, right? The bottom line is we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket and then just assume that that layer is impenetrable, because when you look at the types of breaches that hit the headlines, typically there's a failure at some level, if not multiple levels. And
Right.
so it becomes extremely critical to have a backup, in essence, so that if somebody gets through one control, that there's another control there. And the skill in all this is to allow the approved business functions to continue. So it's not just a matter of building a solid, cement wall around the environment. We've got to continue to allow the business to function.
So what do we have next?
So the next one is kind of a controversial thing, and I know you guys have encountered this, and from a customer perspective, I still get a little pushback on this, but the bottom line is that we had some viral issues with an IBMI server in this case. The customer had a PC, one of many, that was connected to their system and had a drive share mapped to the integrated file system. The customer, in this case, the employee, went home on a Friday night, but left his PC up and running. It was attached. It was locked. I mean, nobody was going to walk up and touch it. But unfortunately, on that afternoon, he had clicked some kind of nefarious link that had ended up downloading a virus to his PC. And that virus began to propagate itself out through the local file system and then looking for any external file systems that were connected. And it saw this drive letter and it said, there's another connection here. There's another mapped drive. What a perfect way to spread myself out. Unfortunately for the customer, this drive mapping was not just to another Windows server, it was actually to the IFS. And so it came over there, it started propagating itself out. Okay. Now, the customer obviously had gone home Friday night, had no idea this was happening, and it wasn't actually discovered until later on in the weekend when the admin attempted to connect to his system to determine the completion status of his entire system save. Apparently he wasn't using robot save and being notified. So he couldn't reach the system and ended up having to come in, and the only way they could connect was to determine that the HMC was available. But even in that instance, the server was partially inoperable. So the infection had done enough damage to the system that it had taken down parts of the OS that prevented the OSs from functioning. So that was an eye-opener for them. There ended up being about a quarter, I think it was about 500,000 files by the time we got there. But what we suggested and what they leveraged was an antivirus solution specifically for IBMI. That's something we have in our portfolio through a partnership with McAfee. And then again, we leveraged the exit programs to ensure that they were policing that net server drive share. So Tom, if you want to go to the next slide, I think I have a screenshot of, so here we can see 248,000 viruses found within this one integrated file system. And this is not uncommon. The actual backdrop to that is another scan that we did that had about 600 files that were infected. In that case, we were able to repair the files. So whether it's real-time analysis and quarantining, cleansing, or whether it's a scheduled type of scan, you need to have some consideration, even in an IBMI environment, to make sure there's no infections reaching the IFS or propagating from the IFS or ultimately doing damage to the system. So this is a new area of discussion. Don't panic yet. Not everybody is high risk, but it's definitely a conversation we should have.
Viruses, right? IBMI, no viruses. Well, there are some major
248,000 of them.
There's been a lot of little different things that have hurt people terribly in that area. And this is kind of an age-old problem. My last horror story, and I'll be kind of quick on this, is just the old end user submitting the same job over and over again because my report hasn't completed yet, right? And what does that cause? Well, it causes the CPU and everything else to go crazy because in this case, it was a report that they wrote themselves that was doing some bad SQL on the system. And of course, it pegged the batch area and nobody else could get anything done. And, normally maybe not a bad thing, but this retailer depends on, orders to go out for restocking inventory and, invoices and all those other things that happen. So these critical jobs that needed to run were falling behind and they got a lot of SLAs and stuff like that. Major, major problem. So the solution here was robot monitor laying on the system and being able to identify that quickly. So this was a past problem that happened, and it happened again, right? End users allowed to get into SQL and write their own things and do their own queries and build bad things. But in this case here, when they had robot monitor, we were able to identify that issue and make it a non-issue. So it wasn't a horror story all over again where they weren't doing business and not meeting their SLAs. We also wanted to take some time to talk about some of the good things that have happened in our experiences on IBM through automation, security, performance planning. So back over to you, Ash, maybe to kind of quickly share this monitoring success story.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Tom. Now, this was a challenge, actually. This was an investment bank in London, actually. And what they had a really unusual challenge. And we used to say, just throw it over the fence and we'll take a look at it. But they had application jobs with variable start times, but with a definite run time. So the start times varied based on the day of the week, whether it's the end of the month, and also how much business had been conducted that day. But at the time, we had a very rigid monitoring solution that was based around days, dates, hard-coded times. So what we developed was the concept of pairing rules, pairing two rules. Rule 1 looks for a message that indicates that something is starting. In their case, it was equation, and it was putting a message on a message queue. So that indicated a phase was starting. Now let's assume this first phase shouldn't take longer than 40 minutes. So when the first rule sees that I've started message, it starts like a stopwatch. It starts a stopwatch for 40 minutes. And that stopwatch belongs to the second rule. So if the job then completes within 40 minutes, great, we do nothing at all. If we don't see the completed message within 40 minutes, that's when we raise the white flag, not the white flag, the flag, to tell you that maybe there's an underlying problem. So it was a challenge, a small bit of development, but we've used it in loads and loads of places since then, not just in equation.
So you don't even have to give up when you think it's a really horror story. You still have some ability to work your way out of it with automation and monitoring.
Exactly.
Yeah, how about you, Randy? How about sharing one of your success stories around performance planning?
Sure. Yeah, planning is again, this is a case where we got involved before the fact. Is an industrial customer who they wanted to reduce IT spend, right, in this COVID era and so forth. And they were looking at—
Raise your hand out there if you want to do that.
Yeah, and this was an on-prem Power 9 system already, but they had 10 plus IBM partitions. But again, they wanted to reduce IT spend, right? So we used Performance Navigator to look at all their entire enterprise and look at their workloads and looking at all 10 of them. And then we looking at going to IBM Cloud. They wanted to go to the IBM Power Cloud. And obviously, okay, that's great. So let's go to the IBM, but we need to figure out how we're going to configure that cloud. So like I mentioned before, configuring an on-prem solution is going to be different than a cloud versus dynamic capacity and so forth. So we looked at their data and we said, well, you don't need to go to the 980, which is in the cloud. We recommended migrating this to the IBM 922, which is, the only limitation there, if those who may not know, is you can only have 4 IBM cores on a 922 is a limitation. But looking at their current performance data, and this is over history, and by the way, we looked at it before COVID. So we're looking at pre any downturn they might have. We were able to reduce their core count from 20 cores down to 9 cores just based on their historical data.
How much history did they have, Randy?
Well, because they had Performance Navigator installed, we were looking at over a year's worth. So we were able to go back, January, December, and November, before COVID, to look at their real, I'm going to call it normal, if that's such a word, workload, right? Because when COVID hit, they'd certainly, like in March, you could actually see it drop. And then when they started slowly opening back up, in like April, May, you could start to see them climb, but they still aren't back to where they were. But they want to be ready. But even with looking at back in January, December data, we were able to figure out that even when you get back there, you only need 9 cores on the IBM Power Cloud versus the 20. And so they were able to accomplish their goal of, reducing their IT spend.
That's a great story, and using the tool correctly and not being afraid to have all that performance data around when you use Performance Navigator, because I know we can press that out and make that a doable thing where you can have a year's worth of data quite easily. And here we got a customer that had 10 IBMI partitions, so I'm assuming they were running performance collection on every one of those partitions.
Correct. Yep. So it was great to have that data.
It was, absolutely. Well, Robin, I know you got a couple of security success stories. What's your first one?
Yeah, it's really a pretty common scenario where a customer comes to us with some type of regulatory requirement. In this case, the customer had actually been acquired by another firm. That managing firm was publicly traded, and so this customer now had to adjust all of their process and procedures to be SOX compliant. So the first requirement they brought to us was to have increased visibility to their system environment. So the system configuration, audit journal events, privileged user activities, things like that. And so we actually brought several tools to bear in order to assist with this. We had Compliance Monitor in order to give centralized visibility, single dashboard type approach to their system configuration. That tool also does audit journal reporting, but in this case, we actually leveraged some enterprise SIM technology. If you're not familiar with that, security information and event manager, it's basically a log aggregation facility, a central point for all of your different platforms. And so in this case, we weren't using Compliance Monitor for reporting, although some of the local admins still got benefit out of that. But for real-time alerting, we were leveraging our SIM agent in order to send real-time alerts to things like authority failures and profile changes and object deletions directly into that SIM. We also took advantage of our authority broker tool, which allows a user to elevate their privileges on a temporary basis, a big deal to the SOX audit crowd. And Tom, you mentioned a little bit ago the idea of being able to do development safely on a production system. Certainly, we prefer not to see that just because of that separation of duty, but it's the reality for some customers. And so having a user in a very limited, permission state on the system day to day was certainly problematic if there was a break glass situation. So they use Authority Broker then to elevate their authorities to be able to do those restricted tasks. And lastly, we actually engaged our services team. So one of the big differentiators with HelpSystems is the fact that not only do we have a lot of tools in our tool belt, but we also have skilled expertise as well. So in this case, we brought to bear some of our amazing services people that helped with some hardening of the OS, right? There's a lot of security controls in the operating system, and we wanted to make sure that they were building everything on a firm foundation.
Yeah, great point. There's a lot of things you can do for free in security to make yourself less of a target, right? So
absolutely.
What's the next security story that you have?
Well, the next one, again, is a common scenario. A customer came to us and they wanted to talk about security. They knew it was an important topic, but they really had no understanding of where their environment stood. And so what we did was engage with a free offering that HelpSystems brings to the IBMI community called Security Scan. And that uses a Windows-based tool to go out to connect to the IBMI system, not in the same way that a traditional port scan would. It's actually logging in with the credentials you provide, and then just going to gather all of the statistics, the metrics about the system values and the profile permissions, the library authorities, the presence or lack thereof of exit programs and antivirus, and give a very rapid view of that configuration. Now, the customer didn't really know where they were starting from, so this was just a great way to draw a line in the sand. It didn't cost them anything out of the gate. It gave them something tangible to share with their management team when it came down to the fact that there were shortcomings that would require some expenditure in order to mitigate. And so they had some valuable asset there in order to do that. Now, we don't just kick that tool over and say, have fun, try to figure it out. We actually will spend time. And in this case, I worked with the customer for about an hour at no cost, again, and no obligation, to explain everything that we were seeing there. So they got the benefit of, my 20 years of IBMI security to explain exactly what was going on, to help identify the highest risk vulnerabilities, and to help justify that, like I said, by prioritizing and sequencing what needed to be mitigated first. So for any customer that has even a general interest in security, or even if they think they've already done everything, this is a great way to either determine or validate that configuration without really having to put yourself out there and spend a ton of money.
And we have customers that take the security scan every year, so it's a
Oh,
great
for sure.
story,
Yeah.
great success
I always tell
story.
people to do that. If they haven't run it in at least a year, run it again.
And some can almost, you know, if they've done it enough, they can interpret themselves to see if they're getting better, use it as a benchmark. Great story. Thanks for sharing that.
Yep.
You know, I think we're picking on the trucking industry, but there's a lot of trucking on IBMI. People don't realize it. It's no laughing matter. Get out of the way the next time you see a semi coming down the road because they're running IBMI. That's my opinion. I tell my kids that. I tell my wife that. But anyways, this particular customer, their challenge was, you know, they were using IBM AJS, Advanced Job Scheduler, and, you know, great tool, runs your schedule, stuff like that, but they needed to pass some audits and stuff, and they just didn't have the auditing that they needed built into their job scheduler. So switching over to Robot Schedule was their success story, providing just some of the standard reports that we've had in the product for years to help them pass the IT audit. Now, another success story that I'm going to share is in the high availability area. What's the scariest thing about doing high availability for most customers? It's the dreaded role swap. Matter of fact, you listen to one of our competitors out there, they talk about only 15% of their customers are even ready to do role swaps or are confident in that process. And so this customer too was very skeptical and had read about the horror stories of doing role swaps, but on their very first Robot HA migration, they split the systems, they did their role swap, and they were amazed on how well it worked. You can listen to that story out on our website if you'd like, and customers called Amphenol. Just a really good success story around high availability and why you have it, and that is so that you can actually switch over to the system in the case that you need to for a disaster, or sometimes it's not a disaster, it's a planned role swap, right? All right, Randy, over to you to share your success story again in the area of performance.
Yeah, thanks. Funny you mentioned trucking. I'm like you, Tom. I'm driving down the highway and I'm driving on the family gets me tired of saying, that's a customer, that's a customer, that's a customer.
Yeah.
Every one of the trucks that drives by.
We all do it.
Yeah. So, the challenge in here was the customer needed to consolidate multiple frames and LPARs. And this happens to be an AIX example, but how do I consolidate 20 plus frames with over 100 LPARs? And understanding the workloads across all these LPARs, right? Again, the solution was we're going to use Performance Navigator, which again runs across, we can collect data on all the operating systems that run on the power system, IBM i, AIX, Linux, and BIOS, right? So we actually used the customer's existing inline data. They actually kept about 3 months worth of data. And so that we didn't have to wait. We have the process to automatically collect that data, but in this case, we didn't have to wait. And of course, this was a reduced IT spend operation as well. But we were able to figure out that they could consolidate this into 2 or 4, depending on, varying HA strategies that they're trying to implement, either 980s or 950s. And of course, that's one thing, right? Figuring out how many of these 980s, 950s do I need? Which model do I need? And let's say it's a 128 core machine, but we're only going to activate 64 of them, right? So there's those questions. How do I configure it? In terms of desired and virtuals, and we also, this was a big Oracle shop. And so we also had to configure how to save money on Oracle with virtual shared pools. So we've looked at how many cores that we're having now, and obviously we're going to reduce it when we go to a Power 9. So we are able to do that as well. And of course, we also did the calculation of, okay, what if we do an on-prem solution with or without dynamic capacity, which, is Power Enterprise Pools 2, which is that PEP 2 reference there. So that's all about, lowering your cost of acquisition. In other words, how many base licenses you need, and you're monitoring this across frames, right? And IBM will charge you by the minute when you go above your base licenses. So our job then is basically determine, how many base licenses you need to break even over a 1 or 2 or 3 year period versus, paying by the minute or by the hour. So it was a great success story, and they're hopefully going to be doing this sometime at the end of the quarter.
Right. Well, thank you, Randy, for sharing that one. And Ian, I failed to ask about polling questions. And do we have a polling question that you can launch up?
Yeah, we do. Here it is.
Awesome. I forgot to even ask you. There we go. Thank you very much. How can HelpSystems help you? Select all that can apply to you. We can help those horror stories go away through Robin's free security scan, a discussion with Ash or I around HA, a performance analysis discussion with Randy, a discussion around automation with pretty much any of us, because if you think about it, automation touches everything that we do. And or maybe you just want to do a technology update call with myself or Ash or Robin or Chuck or so forth and on with our whole team. We can just update you on what's new at HelpSystems and hear what your stories are. We do a lot of those and we like to share those. Ian, how long would we leave the polling question open?
I'm going to leave it open, and we will leave it open. And if you've already answered it, just close it. And if you haven't answered it, if you haven't answered it, go ahead and answer it now, and then just ignore it and go ahead.
Yeah, as you know, at HelpSystems, we've been around helping service go back to the System 38, the AS400, the I-Series, and today the IBM I that's been IBM I and the longest name for the platform for over 12 years now. We help people out, of course, with backup and recovery, HA, document management on IBM I, cybersecurity, as we've heard from Robin and others, monitoring systems like we heard from Ash, business intelligence. We didn't even talk about that, but there are all kinds of horror stories of things that have been done. I just can't even, I shudder some of the BI stories I hear around IBM I. And then, of course, capacity planning. Randy and team can help you with making sure that your next upgrade is a no issue. And then, of course, automation. We've been helping customers automate processes, monitoring, security, you name it, on IBM I since the beginning of time, since almost the beginning of compute, when Randy first started writing programs when he was 5 years old.
There we go.
So, anyways, I want to thank you. I guess we can open it up a little bit here for Q&A. I'll leave the slide up here. As you'll see, we're not just IBM I. We do Windows, Unix, and Linux automation and security. So got a lot going on, and we want to thank you as customers for joining us on this scary session on IBM I horror stories. Any questions out there?
Yeah, if anybody's have any questions, there's a Q&A panel on the right frame of the screen at the bottom. If you don't have it open on your screen, you might need to click on the 3 buttons for more to open up the Q&A panel. I'll leave this open for a little bit to see if there are any questions, not just from the session that you just heard, but from the rest of the day as well. So send those in now.
And panelists, any other kind of comments to the team out there or customers?
Well, I'd say thank you for your business if you're an existing customer, and if you are not an existing customer, let's talk about what some of your IT challenges are. Our whole business model is to build a better IT, and we certainly feel that we're well equipped to help you in that regard.
Yeah, awesome comment. It's been an outstanding day. I need to play back and share to all others so they can also be illuminated. Thank you for that comment. That's really nice.
Yeah, the playback, the vConference, the environment that we exited from to go into the Zoom meeting, playback is there. If you just go back in and sign in and then go to the replay link at the top, I will also send out an email to everybody who registered in the morning with that, but you can get all the sessions now, I believe.
Thank you for the comments, Sue, that their company uses SQL, not to be confused with SQL, but SQL, S-E-Q-U-E-L. And the reason they say if you're not using SQL or you're using some of these other tools that run from Microsoft SQL Server, you're missing out on the fact that your data is already up to date on IBM I, and why not use it for more things? And SQL is a great tool for that. Well, Ian, I want to thank Common for having us on this almost eve before Halloween. I guess it's a double eve. Robin will correct me on that. What would today be in regards to Halloween. Double E?
Why do you think I'm going to correct you on that?
I don't know. You guys from the UK background or Ash might jump all over.
Yeah, we're very particular and accurate, right, Ash?
Completely, very precise, Robin.
Yeah,
Precisely, right?
precisely.
All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Take care.
All right,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.